My presentation is both technical and would also include advocacy, but also to explain a little bit more on how the world is coming together to make the COVID-19 vaccination happen. I'm saying the world because this is really an extensive collaboration of scientists, experts, governments, institutions, and donors in order for us to have COVID-19 vaccines as early as within 18 months or even less after the start of the pandemic. So I'm going to discuss a little bit what happens in each of the stage of the vaccines development. First, on the research and development, how do we undertake regulatory approvals? What are the challenges that we are seeing in the production process? How do we ensure that there is fair and equitable allocation of vaccines? And when the vaccines reach the country, how government would ensure that the vaccines are going to be effectively used? Next slide, please. So I'll start with the research and development and approval for use. Can I move my slide from here? Okay. So I'll start with vaccines development. It was touched upon a little bit by Dr. Berba. It is a process whereby there is the stage where they start with the drug discovery. So this is more really about research and at the laboratory. And then there is a preclinical development where they test the vaccines to animals, the candidate vaccines rather to animals, and then we go to the clinical trials. Many of you have heard a lot about what are the clinical trials that's been going on. And this is the stage whereby the candidate vaccines are tested in human beings. So it goes through three phases. The phase one is to test the safety and the immune response and the dosage of the candidate vaccine. And this is tested in a few number of people, around 10 to 30 people are recruited where the safety, immune response, and dosage is being tested. And then we go to phase two. Once it is established that it is safe, we recruit more volunteers, more than hundreds of people, to again test the safety and the immune response of the vaccines. Once we do a proof or there is evidence for safety and immune response, within these hundreds of people, we now expand the trial to thousands of volunteers. And this is now what we call the phase 3 clinical trial, where we are going to have two groups of individuals who will be receiving the vaccines and those who will be receiving the placebo. And this is where we can compare the safety, the efficacy, and of the vaccines across the two different groups. This is also the stage where we are going to undertake the clinical trial in multiple sites. So it's not only in one country, but in several countries around the world. In normal situations without pandemic, the development of vaccines is really a very long process. It would take around 2 to 5 years or even 10 years. However, in the context of the pandemic, there is what we call an abbreviated procedure where the phases of the clinical trials are not being skipped, but they are being advanced as we are, for example, handling one phase 2 clinical trial, then we are also starting to do a phase 3. And in the context of public health emergency, we allow the regulatory authorities to already start assessing the data on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine while other trials are ongoing. So this is the procedure where we call the emergency use listing that is being undertaken by WHO. So while we are in the process of the vaccines development, our expert committees in WHO start to understand and evaluate the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. And they cooperate with many stringent regulatory authorities in the world and start to inspect the manufacturing process of these vaccines to ensure the quality that the vaccines are manufactured under the most stringent standards of good manufacturing processes. Once WHO lists these vaccines, so you have heard maybe from the media and from very various sources of information that vaccines are already listed under the emergency use listing of WHO. The country's national regulatory authorities can now approve these vaccines for the use in their countries. And the way that they are going to approve that is that the National Regulatory Authority will issue an emergency use authorization to these vaccines, relying on the evaluation and assessment of WHO. If they would like to approve vaccines outside of those that are listed by the emergency use listing, they have to convene their local experts in order to assess the data of safety, efficacy, and quality that is being reported during the phases of the clinical trials. Now, I'll pause here a little bit because I would like to mention that, again, in ordinary instances, we need to fully finish the clinical trial before the marketing authorization or approval of vaccines is going to be undertaken. Once the regulatory approval is undertaken, then we could now, in this outer circle, we could now deploy the vaccines to larger groups of population or to the public, so to speak. However, even during this stage, which we call the phase 4, we continue to monitor the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and monitor the adverse events following immunization in order for us to learn more about the safety profile of the vaccine. And with the observation of the AEFIs, we could prevent more serious ones by understanding the safety profile and making individuals appropriately informed. Dr. Verba, for example, mentioned about anaphylaxis and how we are going to be able to make sure that individuals do not have history of allergies. So all of these are going to be monitored post the deployment of the vaccine. So this is a very short summary of how the vaccines is developed at the clinical stage and how the regulatory authorities, including for WHO, assesses and approves the vaccines for the use of the population. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so with, as I've said, this is an extensive global collaboration, and this map is going to show you where the vaccines are being developed. So in many countries around the world, many scientists and experts have started research and development of the vaccines. And currently in our last monitoring, we have 263 candidate vaccines, 182 of which are in the preclinical stage and 81 are already under different phases of the clinical trial. Next slide. And these are the types of vaccines. Dr. Verba has mentioned a little bit about this before. So I have listed only here those that are advancing into the phase 3 clinical trial. There are vaccines that are using very new technologies that we have not used before. And these are the RNA vaccines. So we have the very popular RNA vaccines, which is Pfizer and Moderna. We have vaccines that are using previous platforms, such as the inactivated vaccines, mostly from the Chinese vaccines manufacturers. We also have also an old platform that we call the non-replicating viral vector, that is the AstraZeneca and the Gamaleya and others. So what is the non-replicating virus vector? So we inject, the manufacturers or the developers inject the DNA of the protein of the virus into another virus that is non-replicating and deactivated, and which is going to carry that DNA into the subject individual who will be the recipient of the vaccines. So these are the different types of the vaccines, and again, while looking at this, I would like to emphasize that there are new technologies, and therefore, because these are new technologies, it also affects the capacity of the manufacturers to scale up the production process. And this is a key message that I want to discuss later on in the other slides. Next slide, please. So, in terms of WHO EUL, you might be asking, so which vaccines now can be used by countries? So WHO has already approved the emergency use listing of 4 vaccines. The first one that went was the Pfizer biotech. The second was there are 2 AstraZeneca products. One is manufactured in India, the Serum Institute of India, and one is manufactured in Korea. So this is the SK Bio. So you might say, why are we providing emergency use listing for different AstraZeneca? Because if they are manufactured in different manufacturing nodes, WHO will have to inspect also the compliance of the manufacturing to the good manufacturing processes. So each of them will have to be compliant and issued individual emergency use listing. And then the last one, which was just approved on March, is the Janssen by Johnson's and Johnson's. And this is a single dose vaccine. So a lot of countries are looking into the production of these vaccines. There are others in the pipeline, like Sinopharm and Sinovac, that we hope to be approved through April. The Gamaleya is also in the list. And Moderna and Novavax and CanSino Bio is also in the list. There are several others that are being currently assessed by WHO. Oh, next slide, please. And you would see that among these vaccines, there are already many countries in the world which have approved the use of these vaccines, either by relying through the emergency use list of WHO or by themselves doing their own assessment and issuing emergency use authorization for the vaccines to be used in their respective countries or jurisdiction. Next slide. So, having discussed the how vaccines are produced and how they are approved for the use to the population, I will touch a little bit on vaccines production. The message I want to show here is that the development of and production of vaccines is really very, very complex. And currently, we know that all countries in the world will have to vaccinate all their population. But the reality is we are being hit by the huge gap of the supply and demand. And that's why we are taking every opportunity to explain, when we have the opportunity, that vaccines development is complex and we could not scale up production in a very, very fast way. So in here, I am trying to illustrate the vaccine production of a viral vector vaccine. So you would see on the first part that the injection of the DNA to a virus that will carry the antigen to the body, and then this is going to be produced, or what we call, there is a bioreactor that will increase the number of, make the virus multiply so that we could multiply the vaccine. And from there, it goes through a process of filtration and purification, etc., before it is going to be formulated, and then it goes through the fill and finish process. Then it has to go through laboratory testing and packaging before it is going to be transported and released. Throughout the process for this specific type of vaccines, there are around 60 quality control tests that will have to be undertaken for each of the for the products, for each batch or lot of the vaccine. Next slide, please. And then another complication is that the vaccine's parts are not produced in one manufacturer, in one site of manufacturer. So you would see here, what I'm trying to illustrate is that the different production processes or stages of vaccine production is being undertaken in different parts of the world. So, for example, in the first part where we are, involves the cell infection, the harvesting and purification. It's one layer of production process, and then another set of production process will be the formulation, the finish and fill, and the packaging, and another is the lab testing. So we at a certain point in time, the vaccines, the raw materials, etc., all these processes will have to be assembled together in a one manufacturing a company before it's going to be tested for lot release before it is going to be transported. So these two slides is the message I'm trying to put across is that vaccines, because they are they go through a very complex process of development and manufacture. And this we need to make the public to a certain extent understand because of the very high expectation, and we need to manage the expectation of the public. Well, we are very, very lucky that we really now have the vaccines that are available. We are in short of supply if we are going to vaccinate all our population. So we need to move in such a way that we are strategic. We're going to prioritize who will get the first batch of the very few vaccines that are available. And Dr. Berba has also again mentioned this in her presentation. Next slide, please. So how do we ensure fair and equitable access? What the WHO, in collaboration with partners, have been trying to do is to ensure that all countries around the world, regardless of their economic situation, will have a fair and equitable access to the vaccines that are made available in the market. It has been very challenging, of course, because we are now hearing about vaccines nationalism, such as the manufacturers prioritizing the country where they are located. And I think that's always going to be unexpected, going to be expected. However, we are still trying to ensure that as much as possible, even the poorest countries will have a share of the vaccines that are already produced. Next slide, please. And with this, different partners has formulated or established what we call the COVAX facility. Many of you might have already heard this. So at the start of the pandemic, WHO convened researchers and partners to establish what we call the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This includes medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines. So the COVAX facility covers the vaccines part of the ACT accelerator. So it is a groundbreaking collaboration to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. And we have here the four key organizations. That's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, which takes care and negotiates for the companies to be undergoing research and development to be part of the COVAX. We have the Gavi, which is our provider of vaccines in many of the lower and middle income and poor countries. UNICEF is taking care of the procurement and supply and shipment to countries. And WHO takes care of the standards, the assessment, and the on the target profiles for the safety, efficacy, and quality of vaccines. So we have come together to again ensure that there is equitable access to vaccines to many countries in the world. Next slide, please. So the COVAX facility has raised around 2.4 billion US dollar to fund the what we call the countries for advanced marketing marketing procurements, and these 2.4 billion dollars are actually donated by governments around the world, including EU, Japan, Australia. So we as well thank all the governments around the world for contributing their resources to make the COVAX facility possible. So the commitment is for The commitment is for 2 billion doses to be delivered by the end of 2022. But starting this 2021, we are already starting to roll out the vaccines to many countries. Next slide, please. So these are the participating countries. We have two groups of countries we call the self-financing. These are the countries who could afford to buy their vaccines and who are the high-income countries, and the COVAX advanced marketing commitment countries are countries that are low and middle-income countries, and those, of course, naturally who could not, who would need assistance to procure the vaccines for their populations. And in the Western Pacific region, all our LMICs, including countries in the Pacific Islands, are covered under the COVAX ANC. Next slide, please. So when the vaccines are already made available, we need to ensure that there is the effective use of these vaccines. We do not want to see any vaccines that are going to waste. And much more, we would like to see that these very important resources will have to contribute to our public health goals. Next slide. So having said that, the effective use of vaccines needs to be driven by the principles of our public health goals. And that's why we are very strong in advocating to the government that they have to plan their vaccination programs to achieve the following. Number one is that we protect individuals by minimizing severe disease and deaths. Second, we protect the health systems. We need to prevent the overwhelming of our health systems. And third, of course, is to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on economies. So we always say that COVID-19 vaccines are very, very important tool against this pandemic, but also it is not a silver bullet. And I would like to emphasize what Dr. Verba and the ambassador has said, that despite the availability of vaccines, we need to ensure that we do observe and implement our public health measures at all times, in every place where we are. So next slide, please. So with these public health goals, I would like to repeat that governments need to prioritize and optimize the use of these vaccines, especially in the context of the very low production levels that we have now. And that goes back to my presentation a while ago of how complex vaccines are going to be produced. So we have to keep that in mind. And our priorities will be the healthcare workers, the essential healthcare workers, those who are in the hospitals and have very high risk of being exposed to COVID-19 on a day-to-day basis. We would like to prioritize our elderly and those with serious health conditions, because the evidence, as again shown by our previous speaker, would show that the poorest outcome of severe disease is very, very steeply increasing to the elderly and with those with comorbidities. So that's why we want to use the vaccines for them in order for us to be able to protect them from severe disease and to prevent death. So can you stay in that slide? So every one of us would want to rush to take the vaccines. But the question now for each and everyone is, should I rush to take the vaccine? So our answer is no, or not yet, because again of the very, very low level of availability of the vaccine. It cannot be to each his own. We need to move together in solidarity as a society. And by saying that, we need to understand when the government will prioritize healthcare workers, elderly, and those with serious health conditions, it is because we want to prevent the crashing of our health system and we want to prevent deaths. So there's a lot of advocacy that we really need to communicate and get support of organizations like SANTA in order for the public to really understand why governments are moving to ensure the prioritization of these three groups and not vaccinating everyone, for example, in the street at this point in time. Once the availability of the vaccines is going to be stable, the government can scale up, and WHO has a mechanism of how to advise the government how to scale up and expand to other groups and hopefully expand to the greater population once our supply system is going to stabilize. Next slide, please. So it is also very, very important for countries to prepare on how they are going to deploy the vaccines. So the preparation of the deployment has started long ago. While the vaccines are being developed at the global level, we have been working with countries to ensure that they have the national deployment and vaccination plan. This is the country's guide in order to deploy the vaccine in an effective manner. And the preparedness includes the regulatory preparedness, like the FDA has issued emergency use authorization to a number of vaccines. And you would see that the NVDP has now identified the priorities for vaccination for the country. We also need to ensure that our ultra cold chain and cold chain mechanisms are in place, because this is the first time in the world that we are deploying vaccine massively to adults 16 years old and above, and targeting, when the vaccines are made available, the general population. So it needs an extensive strengthening of our cold chain and logistics mechanism. We need to train healthcare workers, and Dr. Verba's presentation has really demonstrated why it is really very important for trained healthcare workers to be vaccinating individuals, because we do not know yet the full safety profile of the vaccines, and we need to observe any adverse event and manage them in a timely manner. So again, my closing point will be, we couldn't afford to waste vaccines. So every single dose matter to help us achieve our public health goals, and countries need to ensure the effective and safe use of vaccines. Again, I would like to repeat that we need to move as a whole society, and that we are able to accept and support the strategy for vaccination, of prioritizing the individuals that we need to prioritize, while ensuring that we continue to undertake our public health measures while we wait for the stability of the supply of the vaccines, that we could include the bigger number of population, and hopefully to meet the target of vaccinating 70 to 80% of the population.